So I'll just go into the presentation mode. And perfect. We are ready to get started. So I hope you've seen my my email that I shared some additional. Let me just see the chat again. Okay, I hope you were able to see my email. I shared a reading that is connected with the webinar today, and I will share a second reading after the webinar. Today, as you will see when I send you the presentation, we have a very long PowerPoint because there's a lot to cover, but unfortunately, we only have 1 hour and a half, so we will not make it through all the material. But because of that, I will share some additional readings that will help you follow the rest, every part of the content in the webinar today, and everything that you will need to do your exercise. I hope that Vladimir has shared with you that we will have an exercise that you will be working in the next weeks based on our webinars last week, the webinar today, and the readings that we'll have. So what is the agenda for today? We are going to, as you remember, last webinar, we looked at the big picture and we were discussing how to have a research agenda, but now we're going to go more deeply and say, how do we think about the type of research we produce based on the policy problems that we face. So we will be discussing mostly about how to identify and understand policy problems, and then what can research do in these different types of problems. This will definitely help us plan better our research. It will also help us be more strategic and have more influence, which is, of course, our final objective. So we like to share these steps when we're talking about how to plan research projects in practice and how to have this perspective of policy relevance from the very beginning. We suggest that we start by understanding what is the policy problem that we're working with. So have a clear idea of our policy problem. Then identify what will be the purpose of the research we'll produce. From then, go to identifying research questions and research design. So in this webinar, we will focus mostly on the policy problems and the research purpose, but I have also added all the slides on the research questions and research design that will accompany also the lecture, the reading that I will send at the end of the webinar so that you can finish your reading. So let's start. What is a policy problem? So one easy way to think about it is to think about it as a gap, right? As a gap that we know that we are in a certain position in a policy issue, and that we can have a sense that we should be somewhere else. But to understand that gap, of course, we can use data, we can use our intuition. It might be based on values, that we have a value for something that is better than what we have right now. We also use international comparisons. For example, when we see the scores of the PISA education assessment, a country might say, well, we want to be as good as those other countries, and that helps us identify or frame a policy problem. What is important to keep in mind is that a policy problem, when we're talking about a policy problem, we want to always keep both a knowledge perspective or a technical perspective and a political perspective or a norms and value perspective. Many times, think tanks are stronger in identifying the knowledge or the technical difficulty of a policy problem. This is because of the tradition of having researchers among our staffs, and just our training, we're much better at understanding that part of the problems. But policy problems will always also have the normative or the political side of a problem. And it is important that we consider both when we're thinking about a policy problem. And so that's why today we will go through a framework that helps us using both this, the knowledge or the technical side and the political or normative side to understand policy problems. So what we suggest is that we use the framework of policy problems. This has been produced by Hope, who is a researcher and a scholar from the Netherlands primarily. He's written a lot about the research around policy problems. And I find that his framework to frame and understand policy problems can be very useful. First, because it makes us think about those two things, the knowledge and the normative part, and because it gives us some clear categories to work from. Of course, this is a framework, nothing fits exactly as the framework establishes, but it will help us think about our planning of our research endeavor. So let's understand Hope's framework. His framework establishes that on the one side, or on the one dimension, we have what happens with the relevant and available knowledge that exists. So there are certain problems where we are very certain about the knowledge related to a problem. So this means that we already have the necessary knowledge to understand the problem. In others, there is we are far from certainty. So we have we don't even have the knowledge. We don't have the frameworks. We don't have the understanding mechanisms for that problem. So that is the one dimension that Hope proposes us to study. And then there is the second dimension, which is around the norms and values at stake. And here's the political part of the policy problem. And here it's more about agreement. So it could be that we are very close to agreement to what we want, to understanding where is this landing point here in this graph. It might be that we are all certain that we want to get here, right? But it can also be that we are far from agreeing, and we are standing here and we all see very different options and very different scenarios of where we want to be. And that poses us a very different type of problem. So based on these two categories, on the availability and the existence of knowledge, and where we stand in terms of the norms and value around those problems, the author suggests these four categories of problems. Some that are structured, some that are unstructured, and some that are moderately structured where one of these things is missing. To get a better sense of what this means in practice, we will go through these four types of problems, and we will also reflect on what type of knowledge and what knowledge is useful in every case. This is going to help us get a sense of making sure that we are really thinking, and this is going back to our initial slide, that we have a clarity of having in mind and having identified the type of policy problem that we're facing, understanding really what it is that we are trying to achieve, then thinking, okay, so in this context, that there are many things that interact in terms of a policy problem, what can be the specific purpose of the research that we carry out? So we will start in the bottom here in the structured problems. The structured problems are the most clearly the most clear and easy to understand. So we'll start from there, and then we will go to the other ones. So as you can see here, the structure problems are those where we are close to agreement in the norms and values, and then we are close to certainty in the knowledge available. So let's see what this means. So as I was saying, the structure problems are those where we already have a lot of certainty around the issue, and there is a lot of agreement around the values. These problems are the ones that tend to be more technical and less political. And this is because there is already this agreement on values, right? So we are at a point where problems can start to be solved because we have agreed that this is what we're going to do, and we have a general sense that this is the way to go. We may just not know how to go about it. When we are already in a structured problem, it tends to be that we are discussing this already with policy professionals, with smaller communities of experts that are heavily involved in a problem, because we've already boiled it down to very concrete problems. This is the natural niche for think tanks, and you will see I had this framework when I'm thinking about many of the things that think tanks do and when I'm working with them. And this is a very usual type of problem that think tanks find their niche in, because they are not as political. It's more about finding the technical solution, and that is what many think tanks are very strong at. And the good thing about structured problems is that because there is so much certainty already, if a think tank is able to achieve some change, they are able to show some concrete policy changes, usually. So let's see an example of a structure problem. One is the Center for Global Development initiative of making a market for vaccines. And they wanted to work on making sure that the private sector would have an interest in developing vaccines that were not commercially that interesting. So that was the thinking behind their initiative. There is the case study of this program. CGD has written about their experience handling this problem and putting forward this initiative. One of the things that they are mentioned many times is that there was already a tacit agreement among the community, the development community, the experts in the field, that they needed to develop this vaccine against pneumococcal disease. So the objective, what they wanted to achieve was pretty much agreed upon. So this is what in the structure of the policy problems, we say that the actors were already very close to agreement on the problem. The other thing is that when CGD started working on this program, the idea, the concept of an advanced market commitment of vaccines had already been developed, and some already knew about it. So that means that there was already, some knowledge about the problem, and there was already existing framework to think about this issue. So when CGD started working on this issue, they were already working in a very structured setting. People agreed that this is something that had to be done, and people already had an idea that maybe having advanced market commitments was a possible solution. So CGD jumped into this issue and put forward this blue book. And the blue book took forward both these agreements and this existing knowledge. And what they did was work on how to fine-tune a possible solution. So in their blue book, what they did was identify the size of the commitment. So what type, how much money would we need to make this work? Understanding how could new contracts for sponsoring the development of these vaccines could be put forward. So as you can see, when CGD came into this problem, they brought very concrete ways of using this opportunity that the problem was already pretty structured among the community that they were working with to push forward a solution based on specific ideas that they already had. That is why CGD, and you can review their experience in working in policy problems. They always say that they work on very concrete issues. That is part of the strategy of the Center for Global Development. So as you can see, this is one example of a structured problem. Like I said, this is a very popular type of problems that think tanks work with, because things are already kind of agreed on, and there is a sense of where we want to go. It's just trying to figure out how. And that brings us to this other part, which is in these types of problems, what is the purpose that research can have? So in these cases, many times it's about, like I said, figuring out the financial requirements and constraints for putting forward the solution. So as we know, many times our governments may have an idea of what needs to be done, but they cannot manage to put together the necessary financial resources for that, and research can support it that way. It can also help identify the capacities for implementation. So it might also be that there is, for example, an existing program. People generally agree that that program is a good idea, that it solves the right problem, but the government doesn't have the capacities to really implement it successfully. So research can help identifying these capacities that are required, mechanisms to build them. It is also sometimes necessary to develop the technical, specific knowledge required to implement the idea. This one, I remember the case of a think tank that works on renewable energy. And what they were requiring was really understanding the technical aspects of the problem. So what type of energy to put, where they could install solar or windmills. So this is the type of very technical knowledge that sometimes is required to implement an idea that there is a general consensus that should be implemented. And another purpose that research can have when problems are very structured is to maintain support for a policy or an idea. And this is important because, as we know, our governments are sometimes flaky, our political systems tend to be flaky, and so it might be important to keep support for a policy or an idea that others may be trying to cancel. So for example, let's think about a social program that there is a general consensus that it works, but there are now some groups that are talking about eliminating it because it doesn't, it consumes too much resources from the budget. Then research can help support an idea and keeping a project in place. The hint here, when we're thinking about the type of research that we should put forward when we're thinking about structure problems, is that we should aim at answering the question of how, and not do any diagnosis of the problem for our audiences. So what does this mean? One of the problems that we tend to see in think tanks, especially the ones that are getting started, is that they try to do a diagnosis of everything, right? That is the way that we also used to understand ourselves problems. But when we are already in a very structured problems, it is really about finding out ways of how to make something work. So that should be the focus of the research that we produce. Of course, we may need to do a diagnosis, and we may need to have this as background information for ourselves, but it's important that what we put forward to our audiences are the ideas of how to solve this problem, how to implement an idea. Now we're going to go to the other, the opposite part of the diagram. So if we go back here, we have just now explained what the structured problems are. And now we're going to go to what unstructured problems are. Those where we are far from agreement in the political side, and we are also far from certainty in the technical part. So let's review these types of problems. So these ones are usually also called wicked problems. You will find this type of expression in the literature as well. Because like we said, they have uncertainty and lack of agreement, both in the knowledge and the values around that problem. These problems are very politically charged. So they are somewhat more complex settings for think tanks. Think tanks do get involved in these types of problems, but not as they are not as common as those that work in structured problems. When we are thinking about unstructured problems, we are very far from finding a solution, right? So what that means is that we really need to have a long-term perspective for change to occur. And that means that impact, when we're thinking about the impact that we can have when we are working in unstructured problems, the impact is more subtle. We can help structuring better a problem, we can help setting the agenda, we can promote policy learning, but really, to go from having an unstructured problem to solving the problem with a specific policy solution, it's a very long way. So if we want to see short-term gains, unstructured problems are not the types of problems to work with. Unstructured problems require a very long-term kind of thinking and having this perspective of knowing that our impact will be a stepping stone towards achieving the final solution for that problem. So let's think about an unstructured problem. And I think that the quintessential unstructured problem in development right now is the issue of climate change negotiations. As we know, there is some doubt posed on the technical parts of climate change. So not all actors are in the same page regarding whether the scope and the extent of the problem with climate change. So that leaves us with uncertainty of knowledge around some of the actors that work on the issue. And remember that we're thinking about how those involved in the issue are thinking about this problem, not necessarily how we see it. So you might see very clearly that there is sufficient evidence around climate change, but when we think about the actors negotiating, we know that there is still uncertainty and there's doubt around the knowledge. And we also know that there is a lack of agreement around who is to be held responsible and who should pay the most for the types of policies that are required to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So as we can see, when we cross these two, we have uncertainty in terms of the knowledge and lack of agreement in terms of the values and the norms around the problem. So when I was looking for an example to understand these types of problems, I came with some interesting reviews and analyses of the Stern Review. As you may have heard, the Stern Review that was drafted 10 years ago already was one of these critical reports that was meant to push forward the negotiations around the climate change agreement. Now, looking back at what happened with that report, now some of the researchers have mentioned that the Stern report was ambivalent about what was relevant what should be done at the national level and what should be done at the international level. And it did not really tackle the main issue of the negotiations, right? It was very ambivalent. It didn't really help structure the problem to allow policy action to occur. So when the authors were thinking about the Stern Review, they were probably putting forward their own understanding of the problem and showing very extensively all the possible options that are causing climate change, all the different ways of framing. But in the case of these unstructured problems where we are already so confused, a report should really help us nail down and boil down the problem to something more concrete that we can work with. So when we're thinking about unstructured problems, we have to keep that in mind, that we don't want to add to the confusion. We don't want to add to the already complexity of the problem. So what are some of the purposes that research can have in these cases? One useful thing that research can do is to bring the frontline knowledge to the political debate. So many times the political debate is at one level and they may not see what is happening at the front line. So this can mean what is happening with the delivery of a service, what is happening with the specific implementation of the policy, and these more concrete day-to-day realities that may have gotten totally misplaced in the political debate. The other way that research can support these problems is by developing new visions. And this is something that I've seen many examples of think tanks do this type of work. Many times they do this around election times as well, when what they do is not necessarily put forward only their research, but to create jointly with others a vision of what the problem can be. And this can help structure a problem because it creates this sense of agreement that is necessary for action. It can also be used to create frameworks and concepts to make sense of the problem. So when we're thinking, for example, around the problem of climate change, someone, after reviewing the understanding the problem, came up with these categories of understanding what has to be done around the problem that we hear about them very frequently now, which is that policies to mitigate climate change and the policies to adapt to climate change. As you can see, that framework, that way of conceptualizing the problem has had such an impact on how we understand the problem and how we put forward policies to solve the specific problem. So as you can see, the hint for these types of problems is that what we're really trying to do is to somehow structure the problem so that we're closer to a solution. So going back to our graph here, what we're trying to do is pass from being an unstructured problem towards being a structured problem. And that comes either through achieving more certainty in the type of knowledge and the knowledge that we have on the issue, or also by reaching an agreement about where is it that we want to go with this policy problem. So that is the second type of problem. Now we're going to look at two other types of problems, the ones that are on the other side of the square. And here we're going to start with those problems where we have agreement on values, but we have not enough certainty about the knowledge and what is happening in that problem. So here we can think about different types of scenarios that may be included in these types of problems. One is that we may not have enough knowledge on the issue. We may have a sense because of international literature about the problem. We may not have enough knowledge of what is happening in our country, in our city, wherever that we work. We may have conflicting evidence, and that can be troublesome because then we don't know what way to go or which evidence to believe. We may be in a solution where we have certain knowledge, but it's not framed in such a way that it's really leading to a solution. Like thinking back again at this framing of climate change, right, as mitigation and adaptation. Maybe before these categories were come up with, we knew that there were things that we needed to do about climate change, but we were not really moving forward towards finding more solutions. Another option is that there might be asymmetry of knowledge about among the different stakeholders. So it might be that the knowledge exists, that you have identified some of the critical knowledge, but that not everybody has the same access to this knowledge, and that is causing problems, and not everybody is in the same page about this information. And so what's important in these types of problems is to make sure that we have a complete understanding of everything, of all the existing knowledge around this problem before proposing new research. This is important because when we identify that we are working in a problem, when we agree on values, but that the problem is around having certainty about the knowledge, we may want to embark into doing new research, right? But it is important to first know what's already out there, because it might just be like this fourth option here, that it's not, the problem is not that the knowledge is not there. The problem is that not everybody has access to that knowledge. So that's why it's important to have a complete picture of what's the knowledge available. And now here we will show the one example from Bosnia-Herzegovina. This was one example that was shared with us in the previous course. And the think tank that was working on this issue is the Foreign Policy Initiative that was trying to promote this law of the wine in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the think tank, when they started to discuss why is it that we don't have a appropriate law to promote wine in Bosnia-Herzegovina, they identified, they had separate conversations with different stakeholders, and there was a high level of agreement that there should be a new law to promote wine in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that was the first thing they did. They identified through consultations that there was already this agreement on values. But of course, where there was disagreement was in terms of the content of the law and the procedures that will be included in the law. So what did the think tank do? They went and they gathered frontline information from the producers themselves, and they built together a sound statistical basis that could support all stakeholders to discuss the issues. So as we can imagine, when we're thinking about a law that may have economic effects, economic benefits for certain groups, it's very important to have sound information of what can be the impacts of a policy. And so the think tank did that. They gathered frontline information of what was the reality, what were the problems of the producers, what types of incentives and support they needed, and they created statistical knowledge that would support this. Eventually, they were able to promote the adoption of a law. And so what this example sheds light on is the importance of this knowledge. When there is already agreement on values, it's also very important to focus on the knowledge required, and in those cases, the think tank can have a very strong impact, like very direct impact on what can be achieved. So what can be the research purpose in this case? Research can focus, like we saw in that example, on producing new statistics that can help everybody understand the problem in the same way. Research might help us make sense of the evidence, even when it might be contradictory. So, for example, this happens many times with social programs. As you know, the evaluations and the control trials around social programs have been becoming very, very popular. And now we have a lot of what may seem contradictory evidence. And we were discussing that in our last webinar also. We may have research that shows that there are positive effects of this policy, of this social program in these aspects, but at the same time we can see that there is negative effects of this program on some other dimensions. And so when we have all this evidence, some of it that may sound contradictory, Policymakers may be like, well, I really don't know what to do. You're telling me there's these good things about this, there's these bad things about this. And so it might be useful to have research that makes sense of this evidence, that tells us, okay, well, this impact is more relevant for these reasons. Yes, we might see some negative impact on this aspect, but it's not so bad. We can handle that. That type of making sense can be also very useful. The other type of research that is the other purpose that research can have is translating knowledge among different communities. So we might take some other approach at understanding what are the positions of the different stakeholders and helping transmit this among the different communities. This will help us make sure that everybody is on the same page. You know? So the hint for these types of problems is that we should focus on developing coherent knowledge. What we are missing here, remember, is the agreement on the knowledge that will push us forward to a solution. So we have to pay very strong attention to the coherence that we are giving to the research, to the knowledge we are producing. So here we will go to the last type of problem. And after we finalize the analysis of the types of problems, we will open it up a little bit to reflect on the types of problems that you also work with in your organization in BOS. So it will be very useful if you start thinking, oh, I feel identified with this type of problem, I don't feel identified with these. So keep that in mind. So the last type of problem is a type of problem where there is certainty around knowledge, but we lack agreement on the values or the norms. These problems are primarily political. So people tend to agree with the knowledge, with the evidence that is there, but they do not agree in principle in the values in these issues. When we're talking about these types of problems, because the issue is political and a lack of agreement on the values, this will require a think tank to take a position. Many think tanks don't like taking positions. They like to be seen mostly as conveners, as independent from specific positions, but working in these types of problems may require taking a position on the issue, and this is important to have in mind when we are working in these types of problems, and if we choose to work in these types of problems. Think tanks that have a clear political stance and identity may be better equipped. So we know that there are also think tanks that are political in nature, that are think tanks of specific parties or think tanks of specific policy perspectives, and then since they already have these definition of their norms and values, they might be better equipped at handling these types of problems. On the other hand, those that seek to have independence or neutrality may feel that they're stepping into quicksand. These are types of problems that you may feel like you're getting pushed into deciding on things that maybe you feel that are not issues that you should be working on. In these types of problems, we can include many issues. For example, the issues of abortion in many countries, I would say, are among these types of problems. The evidence of, for example, the bad effect that having illegal abortions have on women, and the statistics of women that lose their life because of abortion And that type of framing of the problem around abortion doesn't take us too far, because the ultimate problem is one of the norms and the values of the different stakeholders, what they conceive as life, and to what extent they feel that they have the right to have a say over the decision of a woman. So as we can see, knowledge has, it's not that there's a disagreement of the knowledge. It's more that we don't agree on the basic principles and the basic norms around this issue. But let's see another example that may seem a little bit less controversial than abortion. Here I'm going to share the case of the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. And they, as you may know, in India, there was traditionally the caste system. And so the Institute of Dalit Studies works for promoting the inclusion of the groups that have been traditionally discriminated, that they call now the scheduled castes or the scheduled tribes, into what they want is these groups to benefit equally from development in India. So one concrete example that they had was working around access to jobs, and they identified that these groups were widely discriminated. Now, there was no agreement on what policy could be put in place to solve this issue. So policymakers agreed there was a problem, there was discrimination, but the actors didn't agree what to do about it. Should we have an affirmative action policy, or should we just have incentives? What should we do around this project, around this problem? And it had to do a lot with values, right? And how, to what extent the policy actors were willing to take an active policy for inclusion of these groups. So the first proposal that IDS put forward was the compulsory quota-based affirmative action policy. So they wanted to have a very, very proactive policy. And they were able to do this because they had very clear values of what they wanted to do for these discriminated groups. Now, this option didn't go through because policy actors were not convinced that affirmative action was the right way of doing it. But what IDS was able to then put forward is that was their first solution. That was the best idea that they thought that should be put forward. This one had a lot of political tensions, and it was not supported by a lot of political actors. So what they were able to do was work for a second best option. And the second best option was that it was not mandatory, but certain companies in the private sector adopted this as a voluntary affirmative action policy. So it was not the best solution, but given the limitations, they were able to find a second best solution. So as we say, what can research do in these cases? Sometimes it's accommodating a solution. So we may know that given the political difficulties and the lack of agreement, what we see as the best option will not be taken forward. So we might have ways of finding second way solutions. And the other thing that research can do is to lower the tensions and the disagreements on the values, either by finding new knowledge that could help lowering those tensions, or by reframing an issue. so that it doesn't focus that much on the issue of that is causing tension, right? So we can think about this again of reframing in the terms of abortion, right? Many of the campaigns and the understanding around abortion has tried to move from it being an issue of choice, that's how it's usually framed in the US, to being an issue of health and of the services that a woman deserves in any case of separate from the values that may be at place. So this is the types of reframing that could be done. But I think that what is most common is what we have put here in the hint, that it's usually about finding the second best solution. We know that we're not going to be able to accomplish our holy grail policy solution because there is no political agreement. So what is the second best option that we can push for? So as we have seen here, we have all these different types of problems. And what I want to go now forward is to understanding how these policy problems relate to influence, right? To our capacity to influence. And like we said, when we are working with structured problems, we're able to have more direct influence because it's more about really finding the concrete implementation of the policy. But when we're talking about the rest of the problems, we have to have a more holistic perspective of what is the influence that a think tank may have. So as we said, in an unstructured problem, it can be around agenda setting. It can be, in these cases, about having more certainty about the problem. Here is about finding second best options. So as we can see, only when the problems are structured, when we are able to structure a problem more clearly, are we able to move forward to implementation and have that kind of direct impact that think tanks many times have. In the other cases, our influence, our impact is going to be much lower. Here we have just a summary of the policy problems that we have, and then what is the role of research. And this is a good summary slide that I'll leave with you when we are trying to explore our own research problems. This is going to help us identify what is the role that research has in each case. As we were saying before, what is important to keep in mind is that when we are working with structured problems, we may be able to find solutions relatively fast, right? When we are working with very unstructured problems, it's a very long-term kind of problem. And this is very important to have also in terms of our understanding and our planning for the types of activities that we want to carry out forward. It will also help us discuss these things with funders, right? If we're talking about a structured problem that in 1 year, 2 years, we may help push forward some specific solutions, then we can work in that time frame. But when we're working with very unstructured, politically charged problems, then solutions are going to be much slower. And we as think tanks need to be sure that we will be able to respond in that long term, that we will not be off the hook after 2 years with an unstructured problem. We will have to keep working on it for much longer. And what this means for a think tank and what we can, how we can use these type of understanding of policy problems. It's also to try to map the types of activities that we work with in our think tank in these different quadrants that we've identified. So we can identify that we have certain very structured problems, and we could put them here, and we could put each project according to the types of problems that we are seeing. Now, what is important to keep in mind is that as a whole, as a think tank, if we are working, like in this example, too heavily in the unstructured problems, here in this quadrant, we have those that where we have disagreement on values and uncertainty on knowledge. If we have too many projects on this side, it might not be so good for our think tank, because we might not be able to see some early gains on policy influence, right, that are always required. So this can also help us plan more strategically and say, okay, we can have certain projects that we need this longer term perspective and that are politically charged and difficult. But let's also think about a couple of things that will also give us some early wins that will help us position our work. And that's the type of planning that we can also do with these types of tools. So now I would like to ask you in the chat if you can share with me what do you think about this? What are the types of problems that you in BOS are working with the most? Are you working mostly in structure problems? Are you taking the deep dive into very complex and wicked problems? And do you see the possibility of applying this framework to think about problems that you have in hand? And also, of course, if you have any questions regarding the framing itself, this is a good time to put those forward. I have gone through them relatively quickly, I know. So any specific questions that you may have, this is a good time to post them. So I'm going to go back to, I can leave it here so that you can see the types of problems that we've been discussing, and you can share with me your reflection of where do you see the work of BOS focusing more? Do you see this being a useful framework for you? And any sort of reflection that you may have or additional questions around these types of problems. So here we have an initial comment saying that, well, maybe you're working mostly on unstructured problems. What do the others think? I can also okay, let's see. And there is a question here. Go ahead about the disagreement on values. The rest, you can also start commenting on the types of problems that you see BOS working mostly in. And like I said, I shared the reading of this part of the policy problems so that you can have a little more material that you can review on this. Okay, so the question here is regarding those problems where there is a disagreement on values. So we are far from agreement on values. So when we are far from agreement from values, we have two types of problems, and this is related to the second question, to the question you have. So it says, is it on the policy solutions only, or is it in the interpretation of the data? So when we don't have agreement on the norms and values, we are in this column. And here we have two types of problems. When we don't have certainty on the knowledge, we are on very unstructured problems. So this is what you're saying about knowledge, right? So it's two different dimensions. So in the norms and values, we'll try to think always around the political part of it. And then the disagreement or the lack of certainty on how we understand the knowledge, we'll put those concerns around here. Because they are somewhat different. That's why when we don't have agreement on values, we have two types of problems. One where we also don't have any agreement on knowledge, and then we are in very unstructured problems. But we can also have those where there is certain agreement on the knowledge available, and the problem is more moderately structured. I hope this answers your questions. I would try to always think separately the knowledge on these dimensions and only the political part on these dimensions on norms and values. Sanja suggests that there are some opportunities where you are working on very structured problems. So this can give some interesting opportunity for you in BOS also to discuss this. How are you interpreting the problems that you're working with? And like you said, it might be that some of you are working in more unstructured problems, and some have already identified much more structured problems. Any other comments? And part of the exercise that I will share with you refers to doing this thinking about a policy problem that you're already working on, or a policy problem that you want to start working on, and going through this thinking about what happens in the one dimension, what happens in the second dimension, and so where does that leave us in these categories. And from there, start thinking, what can research do in these cases, and how can we start planning policy, a research program that can respond to these problems. So I'm going to start moving ahead, but I will have the phone here, and we can see any other chat comments as they come. So please feel free to just share them in the chat as we move ahead. So, as I mentioned, in this part, what we've done is analyze different types of policy problems. We have understand what could be the research purpose, what do we want to achieve with the research. And what is important is that only then, only when we have this clarity of the context that we're working and what is our purpose, do we move into the research questions and the research design. Many times we start here. And here in research questions is where in school, in masters or in PhD programs, this is where one starts with the research question. Not necessarily with understanding the policy problem and what would be the purpose of our research. And that is why think tanks are different, because we do try to take into consideration these information before deciding on a research question and deciding on a research design. So the question here is, then how do you do this about connecting the policy problem all the way to a research design? How do you keep these steps all one connected to the other one? And what we suggest is having this pragmatic perspective. And pragmatism is a philosophy of science, a philosophy of understanding the way of do science that joins both theory and practice, and that acknowledges that there are some practical elements of carrying out empirical research that we need to take into consideration. When we're talking about being pragmatic in doing research, we mean that theory and practice are not seen as distinct realms, but they are the two sides of the same coin, right? And here we could even say that what we're trying to do is, in the one side, having this clarity of the policy problems and the research purpose, and this being more the broader sense, and then the research question and the research design, and this being the most practical part, and having these be the two sides of the same coin, right? So now what is important is to be able to join theory and practice. And that is the critical aspect of being pragmatic with our research. The practice is what we see out there, what we see in the policy space. And this is what we've seen in the first part of our webinar, how we understand policy problems, where are we in terms of knowledge, of values. This is the practical understanding. In theory, the theoretical part is what are the research questions and the research design that we will put forward to respond to that practical side of the equation that we see in the policy arena. And here in the theoretical part, we're thinking about what type of concepts we use, what type of theories, what types of school of thoughts we will use, how we measure, how we collect data. All these are the theoretical, more conceptual part of our thinking that respond to the practical or the pragmatic side of the policy problems. And as you can see, up until now, and we only have 20 minutes now left for this part, we've been focusing primarily on understanding the practical part of the policy problems. And we do so because we get the feeling that many of you probably already have stronger sense of this theoretical part of how you're putting forward your research. But what could be useful is to learn ways of learning how to connect it to these practical policy realities. And to do this, to join the practice and the theory, what we use are conceptual frameworks. And we will go into this a little bit in these 20 minutes that we have left in the webinar. And I will share reading with you about these conceptual frameworks. This might take a little bit longer to understand that we can devote in these 20 minutes we have left. That is why I will also share this additional reading. And after that reading, if you have any questions, we can also answer them through email. You can just jot me an email if you have any questions in this part, and I can clarify them that way. So the first thing is, as we said, once we have this understanding of the policy arena, we are going to go into the research questions and the research design. So on how we draft the research questions, we saw a little bit of this already in the previous webinar. But what is important is to acknowledge that this is an ongoing process and that we shouldn't settle for the first question that comes to our mind. And we shouldn't settle for obvious questions until we have done a complete understanding of what is the knowledge available. We also want to make sure that the questions are realistic and that they are related to the policy problem. That's the whole purpose of why we are understanding policy problems, but also that we take into consideration our own capacities and the time we have. We shouldn't put forward research questions that are too complex if we only have 3 months to work on it, right? And it's important to have as much clarity of this question before you begin any types of field work. And like I said before, we need to know what's already out there so we're not repeating what others have already been working on. So that is the first part of doing the research questions, and we already reviewed a little bit of these on the previous webinar, so I'm not going to stop there that much. What we are going to understand now is go through these conceptual frameworks. And these conceptual frameworks and this pragmatic way of understanding policy research comes from a lot of the work of a researcher called Patricia Shields. She's American, that works on supporting researchers and analysts on policy issues. And I will share some of her reading material that you can also look into. So what she suggests is that what she finds in practice when working with a lot of policy analysts is that they struggle in precisely doing this connection between what they see as a problem and how to turn that into a valid, solid research question and a research design. And so that is why she proposes these conceptual frameworks as the connecting piece between what we see in practice and what we want to do in our research. And she identifies that there are these different conceptual frameworks that have different purposes, right? So here we have the categories depending on what is the research purpose and what is the conceptual design. So she identifies that sometimes the purpose of our research is to explain things, to find a specific cause of a problem, for example. We can just be exploring an issue if we there is not enough knowledge about a given issue. We might just take an exploratory approach. We might describe. We might be in a situation where what we need is to develop categories for us to understand a problem better. We could use research to gauge or to compare how are we doing compared to an ideal situation. Research can be used to help us decide or predict what's going to happen, and we can also use research to implement in practice a specific policy or a specific problem. And depending on what is our purpose, we will choose a different conceptual framework. So here is the summary of the conceptual frameworks that we will explore and that I will briefly explain in these last 15 minutes, as we don't have that much time left. But like I said, I will share an additional reading that has all these conceptual frameworks described more in detail. So the first one is the formal hypothesis. And this is the way we traditionally understand academic research, that we pose a formal hypothesis, and this will help us find an explanation for a phenomenon. We try to identify the causality, and we try to build that specific link, that connection between what we think is the cause of a phenomena and that phenomena. That is why we are trying to explain. And this is why now impact evaluations have become so mainstream, because they try to do this. They try to really identify the specific causes of phenomena observed in the real world. When we're trying to do this formal hypothesis, we're usually thinking about, like I said, impact evaluation, econometric models. We can use other qualitative methods, but in general, when we're trying to explain something, we need very good data. Good data is a prerequisite to do any sort of research that informs a formal hypothesis and that focuses on explaining the causes. I'm going to just run quickly through all of them, and then I'm going to explain how they relate to all of them, how they relate to what we've already seen of the policy programs. Another framework that is used to explain is to systematize existing knowledge, and maybe you've done some of these, which is doing systematic reviews of meta-analysis of existing evidence. And what this requires is the existence of other primary studies, right? And this is the case that we saw in the first webinar of the conditional cash transfers programs and fertility. That was a systematic review. So this also tried to explain, they also tried to identify the causes of a given phenomenon. Now, there are other opportunities where we are focusing mostly on exploring. And then we don't have a formal hypothesis, we have a working hypothesis. And what we are trying to do is to go from intuition to having better understanding of a problem and developing better hypotheses. What we try to do is to reduce the complexity of something that we don't really understand because there's not enough knowledge around it, and that is why we take an exploratory approach. We usually use a lot of qualitative methods to do exploratory work. We do surveys, interviews, focus groups. What we want to get a sense of is opinions and priorities that can help us frame a hypothesis of what is going on that is more solid. This exploratory type of research can be very time-consuming, and it's based a lot in fieldwork. So this is something important to keep in mind if you want to take and to do some more exploratory research. When we want to describe, when we want to help to use research to describe better a phenomena, what we usually do is categories. And that is exactly, for example, what the research we've reviewed of policy problems shows us 4 categories of policy problems. And you can take this approach of research in many areas of your work. What we're trying to go is from just telling the story of explaining a phenomena to being able to summarize this into conceptual categories that can help us have more meaningful insights. And we can see this with what we've already been reviewing before on the policy problems. I can tell you these very many stories about many different types of policy problems, and you may gain some insights. But it's much more powerful when we have these clear categories that can help us understand a problem more easily. Categories are very useful to move forward different policy perspectives. For example, categories is also what we were saying in climate change issues, when someone came up with the categories that policies can be divided between adaptation and mitigation. And that has framed all sorts of policy decisions, from funding to specific programs, all sorts of activities. Policymakers also like categories because they can help them move closer to finding a solution, right? Because we're moving from just many different stories, many different ideas, to being closer to finding a solution. And usually, these categories are a stepping stone, and they can help us into doing some additional research. Then sometimes we need research to decide, and here are the most the techniques that are usually economic about the cost-benefit analysis, the impact assessment, the return of investment, all these techniques that help us make a decision, makes us understand we have different options, how can we choose between these options? And that is what these type of frameworks help us with. And they can be very useful for moving a decision forward. Gauge, here we call this one the practical ideal type. And when we say gauge, what we mean is that we want to compare where we are against an ideal, right? And this is something that is very popular, for example, when we talk about the indexes of the good living, the human development index, all these. What they do is set up a practical ideal, so where we want to be, and then with evidence we show where we are, and we understand the gap, right? The gap between where we are and where we would want to be. This is useful for policymakers to understand where they stand, and also to have an idea of where to go, right? Because maybe policymakers don't necessarily understand specifically the problem, so these can help us in that way. There are different techniques that we can use for this type of research. We can use the indexes, as we said. We can find best practices. It can be both quantitative or qualitative kind of work. And the implementing framework, this is when we are learning while doing, and what we understand here is mostly about the action research, and this means that we are already in the process of implementing a program or a policy, and we carry out research exactly on how the implementation is going in the process, right? So we can, for example, work with a specific unit within a ministry and work with them in understanding, reflecting of how the implementation is going. And that's the type of research that we would consider action research. And that what it does is it collects very specific information of how implementation is going and develops knowledge from that implementation. And it's an ongoing process, right? Where that knowledge we generate helps feed into the practices and the way in which programs or processes are implemented. Okay, so like I said, unfortunately, we are very short of time in this webinar, so I was able just to very briefly describe to you what are the conceptual frameworks that we can use. But what is more important, because you can read about all these conceptual frameworks in the material that I will send, the most important thing is to remember that depending on the type of problem that we're facing, we will have to choose different types of conceptual frameworks, right? So, for example, the knowledge that we use to explain or synthesize knowledge through formal hypotheses, through systematic reviews, those types of research are very useful when we have a lack of certainty of knowledge, right? Because they are really the strongest methods to really explain the causes of a phenomenon, right? But for example, if we are already working in a structured problem, so we already know, for example, remember CGD, they were already working in a problem where they were ready to go into action and working on this market for vaccines. They didn't really need any research explaining why vaccines was important. They didn't need to synthesize any knowledge about the negative effects of lack of vaccines in certain countries. They really needed to help the policymakers decide and implement. And that is why they focus mostly around the issue of costs, of financing, of really, these are the decisions that we need to make for this idea to work. So as you can see, what I'm trying to share with you here is that we really need to think closely about the problem and relate that problem to the type of research design that we want to put forward. Because if we don't connect them appropriately, our research is not going to serve the purpose that we intended in the first place, right? And that is why many times this happens, that think tanks think, well, we don't have the capacity to influence. Our research has not reached the policymakers, is not doing any sort of influence. And many times that happens because we are not doing this appropriate link, right? Like I said, imagine if CGD working on a very structured problem, instead of focusing on really nailing down the nitty-gritty details of how to put forward the idea, they focused on explaining the negative effects of a lack of a market on the vaccines, they wouldn't have gone anywhere, right? Again, let's think about the case of the law of wine, right? The law of wine was one where there was a lack of certainty of knowledge. The actors agreed what had to be done, but not necessarily on how to. And a lot of what the research teams did was gather knowledge that would help explain the problems and understand better what is behind the reality of the wine producers themselves, right? So as you can see, the idea here is that we need to keep these four pieces together, that we need to build this connection between the practical aspects of our policy work and the theoretical aspects of our research. And so here you will see a summary of how the conceptual frameworks relate to the policy problems, and why do they relate this way? So basically, these connections of how different policy problems are related to different conceptual frameworks, that is explained in this summary, and you can read more in detail in the material that I am going to share with you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for the webinar today. I would like to just review the comments that we've had from you in the chat. So, okay, there's a question about this one. Let me go back. This one, of why is it that that it's not a good idea to focus on so many unstructured problems for a think tank. In my opinion, staying in the comfort zone will not do the thing. So, like I said, my perspective is that a successful think tank needs to be able to both show a passion for certain issues, like you said, that you're not in the comfort zone, and that is shown by projects that are in very wicked types of problems. But a successful think tank also needs to show some success. And success is usually easier to achieve in more structured problems. So I am not saying that you shouldn't do wicked problems. In fact, a lot of the think tanks, especially outside of Europe and the US, they work in very unstructured problems because that is the reality of our policy environment. But I do suggest that when possible, you identify some structured problems where you can have early wins. Early wins are very good to show that you have the capacity to impact, that you do have the expertise to move ideas forward, and that will also give you some good reputation, some backing by donors. You know, everything that comes with early wins, with being able to show impact relatively fast. Impact in very unstructured problems is more difficult. That is why I suggest combining, not going for one or the other one. You'll read, and I can share this with you, that the Center for Development, for CGD, the Center for Global Development, they suggest just focusing in very structured problems. That is how they do it. I think that for most of our think tanks in most of the world outside the US and you know, Western Europe, we have to also work in wicked problems too, like you say, like really make the thing to really have a positive impact in our society. Sanja has a comment that that it may be misleading to call structure problems comfort zone. Yeah, exactly. Sanja has made a good point. Being here, it's not necessarily the comfort zone. It just gives us some more certainty of what can be achieved, right? It can still be a lot of work. Don't believe that all problems that are structured will be easy to handle. Many of them are very complex, and many of them will not see a solution. You may, for example, be thinking that things are going forward with an idea, and then comes a veto player that you were not taking into consideration and ruins the agreement that you had already reached. And then you may not achieve anything either. Right? So it's not necessarily a comfort zone, but I do think that it lets us see more clearly the possibility of influence of knowledge on policy. And that is what I think is powerful of those more structured problems. Okay, so like I said, we've run out of time. Unfortunately, I knew this was going to happen because this is the most heavy part of trying to think about the policy problems and how do we connect them with research. But that is precisely why we will be working on an exercise around you thinking of your specific policy problems and how to think and plan a research strategy around this. So what I will do now is we'll finish the webinar now, and later on today I'm going to share with you a second reading around the conceptual frameworks that I think will be very useful. And I'm going to let you do that reading for 1 or 2 days, and then I will share with you the exercise. And then you can agree internally how you want to work on this exercise, if you want to work on it individually, if you want to work on it in teams. Both options are a possibility. And we'll have until January to work on these exercises, and then you will receive my feedback on your thinking for each one of you. So you'll receive personalized comments on the work that you'll be putting forward. Many questions may arise, so please feel free to just jot me an email and I'll be happy to reply to your questions. So I think that is all for us for now, and thank you for joining, and we will be in touch on email. Okay.